Hello and welcome back to Introduction to Cognitive Science. It's been a little bit, so we'll get back in here. Last time we talked about the physical symbol system hypothesis, right? The idea that many physical symbol systems can exist. There's a variety of them. There are it being the sort of the fundamental system we are studying in cognitive science, at least according to the hypothesis put forth. This time we're going to lean in on this and discuss another layer of the concept of this sort of how might a physical symbol system connect to what we are, and that's by way of the language of thought. So, last time we introduced the physical symbol system, the idea that information processing in all of its different varieties, in particular cognition, you can characterize as a system, a physical system for manipulating symbols, right? It gives this sort of sliding scale of complexity for, understanding things from more straightforward algebra type physical symbol systems, scaling all the way up through AI into human level complexity, right? So, today, we're going to tackle one of the open-ended questions from the last time, and that is, if we are a physical symbol system, right, if the way we think is represented can be cast as a physical symbol system, then what form does our human cognition take within that? So the human physical symbol system, human PSS, how can we sort of cast this? So human intelligence, the symbols are some kind of symbol encoded in our brain, in our neurons, right? That's the bare minimum explanation we would need to fulfill here. Expressions might be combinations of those symbols into something higher, something more complex, like thoughts or ideas, right? And then the processes, this would be the mental operation of thinking. Now, we all colloquially understand thinking. Thinking is the thing that you do when you're thinking, when your brain is choosing things, operating on things, making decisions, whatever's going on between input and output of your system. Typically, we think of as thinking. It gets really hard to talk about this without using the word itself, right? And that's a sign that you probably need to drill a little deeper. So that's the idea. And this is what we need to explore, is what is the process of thinking? So we thankfully have a reasonable place to start. What if we consider all thought as language? So we all typically have, well, perhaps not all, neurodiversity is a real thing, and it's kind of hard to pin down all of it, but many of us have a sort of internal monologue, an inner monologue, right? You can produce words internally, like you're practicing a sentence or something, right? And the idea there, like we sort of can experience that in a raw form, right? And then on top of that, the point of language is to bind up new meaning into other symbols, right? One complex idea, like, say, the word car, you take to understand a whole bunch of other concepts all connected. It has wheels, it has a drivetrain, it has this complex mechanism inside it, but we can think of it as a single bottled up word of car, right? And so it makes language a good place to start. It has some of the properties that we would need to interface with a physical symbol system world, right? Symbols, good. Language is symbols, and they can be more complex symbols, and they can form more complex sets of things. Great. But an issue that we run into quickly is there are a lot of languages out there. There's a lot of variety in the way that languages are constructed. The high level instantiations of language that, someone like Chomsky was not talking about, more about the, French versus English versus Japanese, right? All these different languages with different constructions. So the question ends up being, if we're trying to use language as a model for how thought works, do we actually need a specific language? Or do I need English? Do I need Japanese? What do I need? And I think a way of coming at this that can illustrate how we might not is this. So imagine this scenario. So think of the Tarzan type scenario or the Jungle Book. These things can actually happen, right? So a newborn is abandoned in the woods for whatever circumstantial reasons, right? And they are raised by some social animal, right? Sometimes it's bears, sometimes it's wolves. Now, this sounds just like fairy tale storybook type things. These things have actually happened. Social animals don't necessarily need to eat a human child, and they will end up raising them for no other reason than like they can, right? They're well fed. They don't need to. They don't need to worry about this creature, and the kid learns their ways, right? The feral child learns skills to survive. They can hunt, they can forage, they can like sort of build their place to get shelter. They learn how to fight for their own protection, that kind of stuff. And this is real. Again, like these things do happen. They are very rare, of course, right? But they are existing. So a lot of times the ways we find out about these scenarios is that if the child is somehow reintroduced to society, they are found, right? They're discovered as a teenager or something. And when that happens, they have typically missed some critical period for acquiring the understanding of natural language, the way that we speak, right? So they can learn to, respond to certain kinds of sounds and things like that. That they don't completely fail to adapt to, that shape on the sign means I probably shouldn't walk out into the road, that kind of thing, right? So, but they miss this sort of critical time in which they would naturally adapt natural language, whatever language is the lingua franca of the land. They miss the ability to incorporate it as a spoken language, much like if you've ever met somebody who's bilingual. They had multiple languages at their critical period, so they speak them all fluently. Whereas if I'm learning a language as an adult, fluidity is a lofty goal. So the question is, so that this happens sometimes. Without language, how does the child think? If we're thinking about the idea of language as the model for how thought works, then how could a child like this, who has missed the critical period for natural languages, how could they possibly think? This is where Jerry Fodor comes in with his language of thought hypothesis. So Fodor suggests that it's not about natural language. It's just that language itself is this sort of common theme in thinking things. The concept of language, not specifically English or specifically Japanese or French, but the idea of binding up symbols into other symbols and having ways of rearranging them, that is the key. So he proposes this idea of an internal mental language, for which the most basic unit is this sort of mental sentence, and that is constructed in that internal language, right? I suppose not the most basic symbol. The expressions are mental sentences, right? So the information processing, right, the thing that we're trying to figure out, what is thought in our model of the physical symbol system, is the information processing works by the rules that transform language into this internal language, these internal sentences, into other similar internal language structures, right? The idea that we need to transform one complex structure into another one, right? All with similar patterns as we do with natural language, right? So like Chomsky would, even Chomsky's a take on how language works that doesn't really care about the specific language. It's following a certain kind of rule set, right? So Fodor says, well, that might be because all of the brain, all of thought is adhering to this same language rule set. Interesting stuff. So we're sort of running forward with language as the form that thinking takes. So let's look at that. When we think about the state of our neurological system, right? It is necessarily physical. Your brain is made of neurons, right? So at the personal level, the human level, anything you have, any beliefs, desires, thoughts that you have, and like at the sub-personal level, we've talked about like edge detection and vision, right? Whether it's very simple, zero crossings, or it's a complex thought, it's all physical. It's all necessarily physical. It is neurons. That can be kind of a trippy thought, so just work with that, mull that over a little bit. So the interesting thing is that these states can represent things from the world. We can make little representations of things in the world in this internal physical state. And they can have relationships with other states that will help us produce action, right? So let's take a look. You are a brain, right? And you are experiencing the world through your senses, right? This is what this little thing is designed to show. And you hear this word, help, right? What do? You run to give some kind of aid, right? Well, assuming that you're not suffering from the bystander effect and you're like, somebody else will do it. You do what you can, right? You are triggered by this incoming sound, and you make some kind of sense out of it, and you act, right? So how does this? What's the flow of this? Well, it comes in. It's sound waves, right? It's just an auditory scenario you're receiving. You're getting this stimulation. There's vibrations have come out in a very particular pattern that is the word help. You break that down into its lexical components. You quickly realize there's not a whole lot of syntax to deal with here. It's just a semantic problem of what does this word mean, and you incorporate that with your knowledge of what the word is, somehow also physically stored in your brain. You incorporate any additional context that helps you make sense that, this is not a joke, this is not a drill, this is something that actually needs my attention. You consider what your possible options are, and you take your actions. You send back physical physical signals into your body that cause you to run, right? So every one of these steps is physical. All of them. They might change to sort of electrical impulses in the brain, but this is how they move, right? And at every step, you are combining these different thoughts and intentions and beliefs about what's going on here. That's what at least the language of thought layers in on top of this. So the information starts in the senses. It flows through the brain, changing form multiple times until it ends up as these thoughts, right? Thoughts, an understanding of the state of the world and the things that ought to happen within the world, which can then lead to actions, your muscle contractions, and then, I'm running, right? So the question is, how do we characterize that flow? What's the nature of it? What is the right way to think about how this behaves and functions? And that's, again, Fodor's language of thought, right? So getting more specific, the language of thought deals almost entirely in these three things. Beliefs and desires will create intentions. So you will believe something about the world, you will have your own desires, and then that will cause intentions which will guide action. So fairly simple. It's the way that you can leverage your understanding of your own needs, the world's situation, and create actions. So all the mental constructs that combine, compare, and transform from one to the other, it's all language is the idea. It's all this sort of internal language system, which is kind of abstract, but it's thought itself is quite abstract, right? The idea of thought. So hopefully we'll see more and more about why this seems like a good contribution from Fodor's standpoint. So yeah, this is the way to characterize how one way to characterize. I should always put, none of these things are, beyond the shadow of a doubt proven to anyone, right? But these are the ways that the field has developed from these different thoughts. So beliefs and desires. Somewhere between sensing the world and acting on it, you have a bunch of internal states, right? And all kinds of information is available here in the form of a thought. So you can think about the basic thought as these beliefs and desires, right? And these would be sort of small internal sentences. So belief, that person will drown, given their current situation. Desire, I want to prevent that. Belief, life preservers can help in these situations, these scenarios. And then, now this combining these thoughts can lead me to this action of toss the thing, go get it and throw it, right? So this is the idea. We're seeing that somewhere along the line, as we talked about, the zero crossings, the vision, the seeing the symbols, not the symbols, but seeing the edges of lines in the world, or perhaps the edges of sounds in your ear, right? I know that sounds silly, edges of sound, but the shape, right? The shape of sound over time in your ear gets transformed, right? We talked about how vision might take the raw light pattern, turn it into surfaces, turn it into a 3D sketch, turn it into an internal model. The same idea keeps applying. You can keep abstracting up into these higher order beliefs and desires. So this whole idea floats around in the concept of intentional realism. This is the idea that your beliefs and your desires are real. They are internal, like active internal states. They are not, they're not wishy-washy. They are very much the basic unit of how you interact with the world. And they ought to be observable, right? They take some kind of shape in the neural activation patterns in your brain. So Fodor's language of thought relies on that, the idea of these sort of internal sentences and the rules of how language might work does work, to make these beliefs and desires functional, movable, useful tokens for thought. So let's talk about this scenario. This is a leg. It's just a leg. It moves, right? How do we explain the motion of a leg? There are two various scenarios, two disparate scenarios. One is that you are going for a jog to the store. Another is that my knee was struck by a mallet. These are both perfectly plausible reasons for a leg to move, right? One is guided by this, your own, narrative story of your life, and the other is just a property of how bodies work, how neurons that are struck and deformed will create a movement, right? So the explanation on the left uses the concepts of these internal beliefs and desires as a mechanism for explaining why action happened at all. Whereas this leg mallet's explanation just uses simple neural biology, right? So this leads us to something called the concept of causation by content. So this is the idea that your beliefs and your desires, right? These internal sort of mental tokens of things that you can use to create actions are that's the idea. You know, the concepts that we are using internally are what actually end up guiding our actions. So my desire of I need some milk, my belief, moving my leg toward the store will get me there. My rational action, the result is move my leg. Whereas your knee being struck by a hammer doesn't use any internal state. It doesn't need any kind of internal explanation. There's no causation, there's no explanation really required apart from your nervous system, just how it works, you know. If the connected nature of your touch receptors and your motor neurons and the way that, you know, deforming the cell wall of a particular set of neurons might cause a chain reaction of the other ones, all that, it does not require a mental explanation. So, but now we're sort of at a crossroads here because, well, okay, beliefs and desires can cause actions, sure. If we're taking up this causation by content idea, I mean, so do mallets. Mallets can strike things, and if we replace the idea of a higher order thought with just a series of mallets, you know, complex interconnected neural mallets, we might just be mallet machines. But the idea that brings the idea of the language of thought into better focus is that beliefs and desires actually track something semantic. They track with the actual world, right? They help us make sense of the world by keeping track of information that is useful and relevant to guide our behavior. For example, the belief that life preservers help drowning people, right? If you didn't know that, then you would never produce action to guide you towards seeking out a life preserver and throwing it to them, right? So your beliefs and your desires can track the cause and effect relationships in the world. They help us map things. They can keep track of patterns and the similarity of things and associations between relevant topics, you know? So the idea being that beliefs and desires are these constructs, these representations that help us ground our mental thought processes in the actual reality of the world. This is tough. So taking a breather for a moment, these things, we're in a fairly abstract place. We're talking about whether or not language of the mind is connected to reality or all these things. And yeah, it can be tough to talk about these things, and it can be tough to really pull them apart. So it's okay if you're getting a little lost in the woods. We're just hang in there. We're working on this. This language of thought idea it's abstract, but it's quite useful in terms of trying to connect the dots in terms of how do we bring a mental picture of how mental life works and how do we connect it to the physical life of the brain, right? So ultimately, and that all said, these are internal representations and they are still just mallets. They are still physical and mechanical. It is still a neuron doing its crazy chemical thing to create an electrical impulse that triggers another neuron. Do that 1 trillion times, and hey, you're living in the world, baby. So, so these representations, though, are tied to sort of abstract concepts, semantic meaning that's not just your direct physical experience of the world. So, for example, I say to you cat, right? The word I speak the word cat to you. So, okay, good. It's not just a physical shape that I threw at you. It's not just the sound waves, although it is the sound waves. It still is that, right? That is the thing that hit your eardrums and started to turn into a different form inside your brain. But you know it refers to something more complex than that, something more real than that. So, this is where we can talk about the distinction between formal properties and semantic properties. So, formal properties are the shape, the physical shape of the things that you are interacting with in the world. The light that you see, the sounds that you hear, the form, right? The form that these ideas take. The semantic properties are the associated meanings of those things. And Fodor's language of thought supposes, how could the brain possibly process information if it couldn't do abstract meaning, right? The semantic side of all this. Well, let's think about the computer model. How do you represent the number 0 in the computer? Well, thankfully, the 0, right? We've talked before about bits, bits being the most basic unit of information and the way that most computers handle it. The number 2 would actually be represented by a 1 and a 0. If you don't know why exactly, that's okay. I can sort of explain it quickly. It's the you can go from 0 is 0, 1 is 1, but now you're out of digits, right? So you have to add a 1 and go back to 0. We can look up a tutorial on binary if you want more a better grasp of it, to understand why the number 37, for example, is 100101. But ultimately, we can use the computer model to represent all kinds of stuff, like, say, this cat image, this not quite representational, or this actually highly high fidelity representation of the cat. It is just being stored in 1s and 0s inside this computer, inside the video file that you are watching through YouTube, right? This is the structure. So the computer model is capable of representing these more complex concepts in just these very simple symbols. So the computer model, you can represent basically anything with just 0s and 1s. They don't care about how the representation is arranged. It doesn't care about anything. It doesn't know anything. It just is. It is designed to move that information in very specific ways. It still manipulates all the information that makes it meaningful, accurate to whatever task it's designed to do, and successful. So every app you've ever used, every program, every video you've ever watched, every slideshow you've ever sat through, every AI algorithm you've marveled at, they're all just 1s and 0s moving really fast in a specific way. So in the world of the computer model, it's more of the pattern, the way that the physical stuff is laid out, that allows it to make sense of it, to deliver it back to us, right? To go really quickly back to the kitty cat, if you know much about how pictures are stored, you can go 1 pixel at a time, right? And the fact that the 1s and 0s are different values of colors and stuff like that, that helps us to illustrate why the form, the 1s and 0s that the information takes, actually can abstract up into something more semantically meaningful. So, in the computer model, the language of thought sees brains and computers as kind of solving very similar problems. Causation through content is the interaction between physical states, which again, your beliefs and desires are physical states, right, of your brain. And these physical states have a particular structure. In the language of thought, specifically, that structure is language-like. In computers, it's a little bit more like whatever the architecture of the computer dictates it to be. So the rules for interacting with and moving these beliefs and desires around to create sort of intentions, that's the process, right? So changes to any sentence, any internal sentence, is going to respect the relationships between the contents of those sentences. Meaning, that's a sort of a complex way of saying that the semantics will be preserved. So this is where the beliefs and desires come in. We can think about the syntax of thought first, right? We've talked a little bit about syntax and Chomsky and deep syntax stuff, but this also fits in really well with the physical symbol system, right? So the basic unit of the basic alphabet, right, the most simple symbol available in this thought language is concepts, right? The basic idea of any given thing or verb or relationship between things, right? Life preserver, good for drowning, right? Then we have rules for combining those basic symbols into more complex thoughts, right? The sentence, the belief that the handful that I just had, life preserver, good, drowning, it's good to give somebody who's drowning a life preserver, right? That could be a belief. The desire is, I want to give the person who's drowning a life preserver, right? Or rather, something between it. So the idea is that you then, some of the rules that we use, right? Another piece of the physical symbol system is we must have rules to change these sentences, these internal structures, into something else, and in this case, actions, right? So it's got some chunks in common with Chomsky, right? There's nouns, verbs, noun phrases, verb phrases, these structures where they're working a different angle, but you see some parallels, I think. So the cool thing here is that when we get to the semantics of this, right? So if these are the rules of how the thought how any given set of thoughts composed of concepts can be rearranged and produce intentions that we act upon, then the other side of the coin is the semantics. And that, thankfully, is that's kind of what we've been harping on here. Any given concept corresponds to real-world objects and actions and all the other things, which ultimately is how we tie this abstract internal language concept. Hard to not mince the words that we're using these days. So these things are tied to reality, right? If I say the words, Dallas is north of Houston to you, that's not just a sentence that you can make sense of. It's also a set of real-world concepts. When you tie Dallas, the concept, you have it's in a space. It's sort of in Texas. You know all these things about that concept. North is another concept. It's a relational concept. Houston is another concept very similar to Dallas. So that internal construct of these related concepts, that can be a belief. You can also have the belief, for example, Yahoo as a company isn't doing well. Now, these are, again, we don't want to think about this in terms of like the raw language, right? This is a little bit wordy for the kind of thing that we're talking about. But Yahoo, company, and doing well are sort of distinct concepts here. Okay, so now we've discussed the semantics of this language of thought. We move these concepts as sentences around, and we try to produce something. What do we produce? Well, that's the outcomes of thought would be useful, rational intentions. Now, these can be momentary intentions like run to get the life preserver, or they can be more just like kind of general things that you hang on to. Like, okay, here's a rational intention. Desire, don't lose money. Belief, investing in Yahoo loses me money. Intention, I won't invest in Yahoo, right? And that is a meaningful sentence in the language of thought that helps guide your behavior. So, the language of thought is a way of applying this concept of language to how the abstract symbols that connect to the world in our brains, how they can help us maneuver through the world, right? And it has a lot of things in common with other formal languages. So, but specifically more formal languages than natural languages. So more in the lines of logic, algebra, computer programming languages. So they have these sets of specific valid transformations, very specific meaning constructions, and they have there's no ambiguities in language of thought. To boil it down, language of thought behaves a little bit more like a programming language than it does all the natural language stuff, all the hairy, interesting, like, you can expand this sentence forever kind of thing. It's a little more like streamlined than that. It's a little more formal logic. So let's return to the feral child. How now might we characterize how a feral child thinks? So, if we were going to try to apply natural language, the normal kind of language model, well, the feral child doesn't have any of that. But with language of thought, it starts to make a little bit more sense, right? They don't need verbs and conjugations and proper tense structure. What they need is a way to tie abstractions of the real world, things that they have direct experience with, into this sort of internal language of beliefs and desires. So a desire that we could imagine this kid keeps track of pretty quickly, pretty easily, is I am hungry. Again, strip off the sort of the nice, clean English set dressing here and just get to the core concept. Hungry, hunger. That's a raw physical state this kid will experience, for sure, right? Your body tells you when you are hungry. That's a thing that they would do well to make an internal note about, right? They should build up a concept for what hunger is. They also have experienced in the past, the red berries are nourishing and not dangerous. You can imagine maybe the blueberries weren't as fun for this kid. Blueberries are great, but I mean just color, random berries, green berries, purple berries, right? So the kid has an understanding of red berries. They see them in the world. They know what they are. Of course they do, because they would need to keep track of the red berries as a distinct concept. They also need to know that they are nourishing. So after eating red berries, things are good. Double good because I didn't get poisoned either, right? I didn't end up throwing up all of the red berries. Although I also have these other set of beliefs that I sort of have picked up over my time living in the wild. Wild boars live near where the red berries are, probably because they also like the red berries, right? So another belief is that I am currently too tired, perhaps based on experience, to risk encountering a boar today. So you combine all of these thoughts, this desire to be free of your hunger, and these beliefs about the world, the way how good red berries are, the habits of boars that I've experienced, and my current situation, my current state. And my rational action that I pull from all of this, again, without English, but more based on these raw concepts having meaning having a semantic tie to the actual world they live in, then instead of, going and getting mauled by a boar while I try to eat some berries, I'll seek different food, right? I'll seek other berries. I'll get some other kind of food going on. I'm too tired. Today's not the day for a boar fight, right? So I hope that illustrates how we can tie the experience of the feral child and how they can process the world, get rid of the idea of any language that you actually already know, and just talk about it in terms of a sort of internal language of thought. So to recap little bits of that, the representations don't matter much. They don't need to call red berries red berries. They just need to have a unique identifier, right? They could call them bloggles, and then the boars might be boobles. It doesn't matter. It's an internal representation, right? And again, no natural language. You don't need in English or Japanese to track that. But just because the child can't articulate in any natural language what its internal states are, doesn't imply that those states don't exist. And to wrap it all up, these states are physical, they're logical, they combine, they are rational and intelligent action. The kid made a pretty good call in the example, right? I'm not going to go near the boars. I don't have enough energy to handle that situation. That's a pretty good call, kid, even though you don't know any English. So this is the idea. We're trying to explore how we can connect this idea of having a sort of internal, almost machine language going on that helps us make sense of the world. So some other implications that come from this, or at least other things that the language of thought does need to sort of capture, are this gives us a nice way to think about innovation or learning, right? It's not hard to figure out how you might build a new belief, right? Or perhaps even a new concept. Maybe I haven't seen these berries before. The orange berries have shown up in my vision now. Ooh, those are distinct. I need to learn that is a separate concept. But then also, I can build new information, right? I can say, other berries are good. Perhaps these berries are good. Now I'll try. And I try them, and I throw up, and I realize, okay, these berries are bad, right? So you can derive new rules. Wild boars roam here. There's an inversion that you can do to say, or not inversion, but I guess an extrapolation. So wild boars roam here. They might roam other places too, right? That's pretty important information. If you thought boars only existed in one place and you had to avoid them, then you might be out of luck when you're surprised. It's not a good surprise to have. You can get new observations, right? Oh, I was talking off the cuff. I didn't see the purple berries, but yeah, the same idea. Purple berries make me sick, right? And the cool thing is, you can get all of these by just breaking up the other thoughts, the other beliefs and or desires that you've seen or had, and moving them around. Symbol manipulation, right? The same process we were talking about for how to build a new intention, you can build a new belief, a new desire even. Maybe you've got new words for a desire that you already had. So yeah, that's a powerful tool in your cognitive belt to be able to capture new ways of thinking about the world around you just by the way that your language system is working, your internal language of thought system is working. And that satisfies some of the important stuff about being a physical symbol system, right? You need to be able to manipulate and change your rules and your information in specified ways. So let's slot the language of thought back into the physical symbol system definition. right? So human intelligence by way of the language of thought. What are the symbols? The symbols are concepts with real-world semantics. The expressions are these beliefs, desires, and intentions, these internal sentences, right? Things that we can combine and know about the world and use to interact with the world. And the processes are the ways that we can break apart and recombine concepts using, rules of language, that kind of stuff, similar to the syntactic structures we talked about with Chomsky. So, yeah, this ends up satisfying pretty cleanly. Hey, here's a way we can think of the human mind as a physical symbol system, right? Because ultimately the concepts are physical. They are patterns in our brain, neural activation patterns. And so is all the rest of it. So, okay. How does this all influence cognitive science broadly? Well, COG-SCI, we treat information processing typically as a form of computation. Language of thought gives us this strong method for characterizing the rules and structures of that computation. So it helps us make sense of a lot of things. We can acquiring new concepts and learning new ideas, or maybe innovating to solve a problem that we don't have a simple combination for. Just general decision making, just everyday life as we move and live. When we decide a thing, it kind of makes sense in this language of thought form. And of course, this also would help us acquire actual natural languages, right? Being able to, using these rules, it seems like it would be a pretty straightforward step, almost like a Turing machine, applying any algorithm. This sort of basic language of thought would very easily help us acquire, or at least make sense of the acquisition of natural languages. But it's important to note that it's not a perfect theory. Language of thought it pretty strictly sticks to the computer model. The idea that human cognition is most closely related to the sort of abstract digital representational model of computers, right? And we'll see in a later chapter more discussions of sort of dynamical systems where we see the brain as a mass of distributed processors that can operate with or without the need to explicitly define these internal states. So we'll talk about that in the future, but the point is that remember that there are a lot of different angles by which to view the mind, the brain and the mind, the brain and the mind and the consciousness, all these things together. So, yeah, it's a strong theory, and it helps us to sort of map how abstract information processing in the brain might be captured by a formal concept of how those many processes work. So next time, we're going to get into the Chinese room argument, which, just to tease, hey, the language of thought is all well and good, but is moving and processing symbols, arbitrary symbols in your electrical, neural activations, no matter how fancy and complicated we make that, is that really that different than just hitting your knee with a mallet? So that's where that you can look forward to that. All right, final thought. What's a belief you once held but no longer do? Can you conceptualize how other beliefs, desires, and intentions may have interacted to help you discard that belief? Is there more to the picture than these specific forms of internal sentences? All right. Thanks. Take care.